And I will go ahead and start the recording so that we can post this. Again, welcome to the Workamajig webinar on expenses. We're going to be covering some top-level expense entry from estimating, purchase orders, vendor invoices, expense reports, miscellaneous costs, and credit card charges. So just so you know what we'll be covering, I do want to note that you're certainly welcome to dive deeper into things that we'll go over a little more of a top level today, and you're able to set up additional calls with your account manager if needed to go over the setup areas that will relate to what we cover today, both system setup, employee setup, approval setup, and so forth. So certainly note that we won't go into a lot of those setup areas. I might talk and answer as many questions as I can related, but we're going to be covering these at a little more of a top level area. So just let us know either by emailing support@workamajig.com to send questions, additional questions after the call to your account manager, or set up additional calls if needed. I did also want to, for those of you who have not joined before, open up the help guide, and I just typed under my name to open this up, and I actually have it open here to explain that any of the past webinars are also available to review the recordings. You can just open up the support guide, type in webinar to get back to the past webinars and recordings. This recording will be posted in a few days as well, and then register for any upcoming webinars. So the format also is to just chat some questions. If it's something that I'm getting close to covering during the session, I may hold off on answering that as I get into those areas, but I'm happy to answer as I can, and then some of them I may hold off until closer to the end of the webinar to answer, but certainly chat any of the questions that you have as we go along, and I'll review those as I can and cover as much of it as possible. So again, welcome. Glad that you're all able to join. And what I'm going to start with today is the actual project estimate, and there's a couple of reasons why. So I have a couple of projects open. I am going to show you where I've started. I came into the main menu of Workamajig, and I came to the purchasing module, and today. Now there might be times, and depending on your organization, certainly you can be creating what I create today as expenses other places and other ways. You wouldn't have to have the today purchasing necessarily, but of course you would need the security rights to be able to create some of the expenses that may or may not relate to projects, possibly to a billable client project or overhead, so whichever type it may be. So I'm going to actually start though in one of the projects that I have created. I have a couple expense projects in here. I named them Expense Project 1 and 2. Nice lame names for my projects. But what we're going to do is start in the project itself, because first thing we want to review is that you often want to budget for the project expenses. And so I am starting in a client project. I named it Expense Project. It actually has some time as well. But I want to be in here to first estimate what the expenses may be on the project, to show how easy it is once these are estimated and approved, how we can create an order, and then later when the vendor invoice comes in, reconcile the order to the vendor invoice. So I started an estimate. If you did not yet have this started, you would just come in and do a new estimate, and then we'll both be able to estimate labor and expenses. I'm going to focus, of course, today on the expense estimate. So when I open the one I previously created, I'm going to be here, and I did add a couple lines, but I'm going to show you how you could just insert whatever expenses you might be expecting on the project. So I have a couple entered in here. If I click on the line, you can see that I can expand or collapse the line. So if I'm here, I could be tabbing through what the item is. Maybe I already know the vendor and enter the expenses that I want to be estimating. I could also come into some more detail to add some information in fields that I don't see on the initial grid. Now keep in mind, your system may look a little different initially than this one. That's also some system setup, some customized grid settings and so forth. But basically we're entering a row to say, well, what is it that I expect to have on here? Maybe I even know that I will have some mileage on an expense report, or an item that when I go to do possibly a task of reviewing with the client and getting the approval, I can associate it to a task. Whether or not you require that's up to you. Maybe I need a vendor, maybe I don't. That's up to you. You know, it's just what's the expense that I expect, and do I know the amount and the quantity I want to estimate what this, you know, we'll even put, I don't know, 75 cents. So it's simply entering a line, estimating that item. Now the list of items you have and what's in the system, of course, is possibly already customized. That's something that's in your system setup as well. So what do we need on this project? What are we expecting? Again, if it's something such as printing, shipping, I can already enter the vendor as well. So what that does is if I already know the vendor, I can then easily, once I approve this, just create an order from here. So what we're going to see is we don't have to rekey everything, because everything's already on the estimate that we have. If we provided this estimate to the client and we've reviewed it and now it is approved, what we'll see is the ability to connect an order to what's already in the estimate. So I'm going to go ahead and just approve this now so that we can see that other step. So once I approve it, what's nice is I can come back into the expense estimate and I can do a couple of different things. I can come up to the approved one and I can start an order right from here. Now, the two lines I have here that have a vendor, obviously you need a vendor to be able to create a purchase order, but it lets me say, okay, here's the estimated items on this. I'm going to go ahead and just create an order right from here. If it's multiple vendors, it would just create obviously one per vendor. So I can do it this way. I could also come out to my page and just start the order outside, and it would find approved estimates for me to now decide what estimated items I want to just pull onto my order. If you do it that way, maybe you have an order going to a vendor that's across several projects. You could do that because it would allow it to just say, here's an order for these different projects, and it would allow you to create an order that way. For ease, I'm going to go ahead here and just create my order right from my approved expense that's in this one project. So what we'll see in the project is I now have a purchase order. What it created for me is one line per those expenses from my estimate. I didn't have to type anything into my order. It already automatically came in for me based on what I had approved on that estimate. Now, what I can do as well, if I have a project that has some specifications on it, I can add those to my order. So maybe I have some printing or some web specifications or whatever it might be. Your custom specification sheets that are already on that project can be linked to the order. Whatever vendor contacts I have associated here, I could add to the notifications so that once this gets approved, they get an email saying, here's our order that we've approved. And of course, we can print and send the order of a variety of ways to the vendor once it's approved. Now, before I approve it, if we print the order now, what's nice is it automatically shows it as a draft. It shows here's what we have, but it's not yet approved. So I immediately see that option as a draft. Now, the approval is based on some setup of who has a specific limit in their employee record, so it can look to all or those that have a purchase order limit. And you could set it to only have the person with the lowest limit be the approver. There's some transaction preferences available and things like that. Or it could be set to just say, send it to anyone with the limit, and whoever gets to it first can approve it, and it can go forward, and then it won't be seen by the others. So it can be either way to decide who's going to actually be approving this. And if the person creating it is not the approver, they would see a button here that would say submit instead of approve. So I'll go ahead and just approve this for today. So what's nice as well, you may have some markup, and we didn't talk yet about that, but whatever's on the estimate and whatever's on the order could also have a markup. I had a markup on the printing, not on the shipping. These things can come from the item itself. It could come from a default client markup that's already set up, or you can specify in the project a specific markup. Either there's even an item rate sheet that can have some markup detail related. So that can come from a variety of places, or you can simply enter the markup at the time. So we have our order in the project, and it's related to the estimate. If I come back into my estimate, what's nice is if I look at the expense estimate, I can also see here the linked order. So because I immediately created it and related it to the estimated expenses, it ties the two together. I could open it from here. I think I just made a copy accidentally, so sorry about that. I should delete one of these, maybe this one. There you go. There's a little training tip, inadvertent. But you can see that it ties together nicely. Here's my other one that I had. Again, there is a way to quickly copy and create another one right from the line, which is what I hit instead. But it's all tied together nicely. Now, if I look in my project, I can review my budget. So because we've estimated it, I can now be tracking what have I estimated, what are the expenses I estimated, and what are my actual expenses. Now, this can be done by the item, by the type, by the task. So I can be viewing the budget out here a variety of ways. So where we're at on our budgets, I can be reviewing. This is the individual project budget. You, of course, have the project budget analysis that can go across all projects. But I can be tracking these to see, are we way over budget? Do we need to have a discussion, maybe a change order estimate to, or if there's a scope change, maybe I need to estimate another expense that I didn't do initially. All of your approved estimates become your budget. So whether it's the original, a change order, or just additional estimates, they all become your budget. Now, one thing I did want to show is if I came out here manually and I said, well, now I have a purchase order, and it's for, maybe it's for a different vendor, maybe it's for images, and I put in that same project, and I say, well, here's an order, and I have an item, and maybe I have, I don't know, 10 items that I want to create an order for. And I put in my, let's see what I have in here, maybe some stock photos. And I save this. What's nice is I can see immediately, anytime I create an order that has not been budgeted and I don't have it associated with any approved estimate, it shows me. I have an item on here that has no budget on it. So I can see that I'm going to create this and it's going to be outside what I've budgeted. So again, that can help you make decisions of what you want to do, if you need to have some discussions with the client or so forth. So it shows you by item, by task, whatever it might be, whether or not there's a budget in the system for that order that's being created, and or also a vendor invoice would be the same. So, okay. So I don't see any chat yet, so everyone must be fine with some. Oh, I do see a question. Sorry, there is a chat and then there's also a QA. So I do see what's the difference between expense project and an estimate. The expense project is actually just the project to connect anything to it that I wish, assuming it's in a status that can allow time and expenses. Now again, I named this expense just so it was easy for me to find today. Whether or not it contains expenses and or time would be up to you. It's the status itself that controls whether or not I can add expenses and or time to this project or not, and that's customizable by you. The estimate is really just the budget of the project. So what projects I have would then contain a budget to then be determining in there, am I under or over the hours that I anticipated or the expense items that I anticipated on this project, so that I can keep track and know whether or not we're going to be okay with the project itself. So that was a question from Julia. I think hopefully I did answer that. And yes, we can have multiple projects on a single order. I'll show you that. And if I came out here and I started an order and I have that same vendor and maybe I say it's Zippy Printing and I don't put a specific order yet on there or a specific project, I could come in to the order and I could say, well, this is an order for printing. So I'm just going to do a manual order out here. And I could save this, and what I can do on the line is I can associate each line to a different project. So maybe this printing to the vendor is for project 1. It might be for 5,000. Now I already created one for this one, so we'll see. Let me just make that 500. So if I insert another line, I could have this to project 2. And I could have a printing order going to the same vendor for 2 different projects. So we're going to see on the vendor invoice as well that this is the same thing. It's going to be able to associate any expense item here, credit card charges, to one or multiple projects, because it's this line here that is actually the connection to the item. So if this is for a hotel or, I guess I'm in a printing vendor, I better keep it printing, I can associate it to multiple projects. So these would each be a separate expense on these respective projects. Let me see. So I think that was Gail's question. I think that answered that. And we'll see this as well when we go into the vendor invoice. And then the external bid, I'm glad somebody asked that, if I would be showing multiple external bids for an item. I am not going to show that. It's a request for quote, I believe, Stuart, you're talking about, is one of the questions. We do have the ability on an estimate. I'll just show you briefly. That would be a separate additional piece and more detailed training with your account manager. Let me go ahead and delete this, by the way, while we're showing that. But we do have the ability, and I'll show you in my project 2, that what is being referenced, that if I'm in here and my estimate's not approved and I have an expense estimated, but I don't yet know the vendor, I can come in and I can create a quote and send this out to multiple vendors. I can send one or more lines out to multiple vendors to get a bid. I can also do it for multiple quantities, but this is quite involved, especially the multiple quantity options. So this would be an additional call with an account manager. We might be doing a webinar on it down the road, but it does allow you to come in, send out a quote to multiple vendors, get replies from them, and then once you receive the replies and they're all completed, you can simply pick which vendor, and when you pick which vendor, it automatically updates your estimate for you. So it is a great feature, and I'm glad that you did ask about that because it is one step before then updating and your estimate with the chosen vendor, and then once approved, creating your purchase order from that. So that was the other question I saw. Thank you for that one. And I'm going to be just answering those as I can versus typing those in. So hopefully those, if you, again, have additional questions on some of those features, we'd be happy to delve deeper into those. But for time and making sure I get through the other expense entry items, I do want to not dive too deep into that request for quote. But it is available, and certainly we'd be happy to show you more details at a later time on that. So I now have in my project, I have the transactions of an order. If I search in here, I can see the order that's created in the system. I did have another one also created for that iStock photo that I did separately that didn't have a budget. So I'm seeing the connection to the project. They're in here and available. Now, another thing we're not going to go through today is pre-billing orders, because that really relates to billing. But do note that approved orders to become available transactions that could be tracked rather than waiting till the vendor invoice to come in. They are available for billing. Today, what we're going to do, though, is go forward and now say a month later, maybe a week or two later, your vendor invoices you. We're now just going to reconcile the order to the vendor invoice so that we can see that piece. But do note that they are available for a pre-billing option if that is your workflow, and we would then track the accrued costs until you later get your vendor invoice. And it also notes and knows immediately which you have billed to the client or not, order versus invoice. But what I really want to do now is come in to show that once we have the order in, it's approved, then later we get the invoice from the vendor. When we enter that vendor, what's immediately available is any open order. Now there's another order in here from another time that somebody else had already earlier created, probably a different project. So what I can do in the first entry screen is I can decide, well, is there invoice for more than one order? Is it just for one order? And I can decide this here, or I'll show you if I don't pick the order at the moment, I can also do it in the next screen. Oh, that's a long number. So what I can do is I can really decide, well, what's the date of my invoice? Now, of course, my order, my invoice came in basically the same date. I'll say this came in a day later. But it shows me if I save it, the other thing I get is this. Do I really want to enter this with no dollar amount? Well, yes, because I know I'm going to reconcile it to a purchase order. And when doing that, what I have the ability to do now is add it here. So if I didn't pick the order, the specific order related to in the first entry screen, I can still do it here. And what's nice here is I can narrow it down based on a date range. I can come in now to just say, well, I just want this order, not all of them, or maybe I just want the specific project that was my expense one project, and that would then limit it based on the project. So there's different ways you can be filtering this to say, well, what is the vendor invoicing me for? Is it $7,100 or is it just this one here? Now, there's a couple things we'll talk about here for a minute because What's important here is that maybe the order that you gave the vendor was 5,100, but when they sent it to you, it's 5,200. Well, and that comes up a good bit. So you say, okay, well, was it because the shipping was just an estimate and they really didn't know and it ended up being more? Is it less than the amount? Maybe you're coming in and they're just charging you for part of the printing right now and it's only 3,000 of the printing. Well, what happens is it will still leave open the remaining amount to connect to a later invoice. So it really depends on what the workflow is as far as how you are reconciling this. Are they billing you all at once? Are they billing you part of it? The biggest thing, though, is that you have the order as a contract, so you really are trying to track whether or not that matches the invoice. So if it's, what's your threshold as far as, you know, if it's so much over what we ordered, do we care? If it's, you know, 10% over, if it's less than what we ordered, great. We can still just say, you know, maybe it was 4,900 and you're still really finished and it was less than what you originally anticipate, but you still want to close it. So there's going to be those options and decisions that you would make to decide, you know, what do I want to be changing or not on the order, because you're trying to reconcile it, and I'm going to cancel that for a minute, to what you've really ordered. And so it's important to decide too, if I say, well, it's part of the printing and I say it's only for 3,000 of the printing, that's fine. I can come in, I can save that, and it's just going to reflect that amount on my vendor invoice. Now, what I'd like to do is go ahead and show you this, because what this will do, because I waited for the vendor invoice, if I approve this, now this becomes the billable transaction on my project, not the order. But the other thing that will happen is based on just having a partial amount, if I come back in and maybe a week later, now I'm out here in September and I have that same vendor, I can still see the remaining open amount of that order. So it's showing me that total remaining amount here. I can select it. I can say this is the remaining, whatever it may be. And now I can simply close the entire order because this is the remaining amount that they billed me for. So it's going to keep that open for you to still reconcile to later invoices. If I save that, we see that I now have the total amount invoiced. I also can see what it's applied against. Here's my order. I can click open the order. I can see that this is now completely applied to my vendor invoices. So everything gets connected. And it also can show me that I am now finished and my order should be closed, based on closing those lines when I do the final reconciling to the vendor invoice. So I'm going to, just for a quick second, I'm going to go through the questions that I think that we've already covered. I'm going to just dismiss the ones that I've answered. If I haven't answered them fully, certainly come back into the QA as far as multiple projects on a PO, creating a, let's see, create the PO from creating the estimate. I can show that again. I'll show that again in just a second. And then the request for quote. So I'm going to dismiss those questions. I think the one other question was if I have an approved estimate in the project and I have my estimated expenses here and I know who the vendor is, I'm going to also put a consulting company here. I have to spell it right to find it. If this is approved, I have the ability right here in my estimate to now create an order. And I can create it for all lines, maybe if it's obviously different vendors, it would be multiple orders. But yes, I can, once I have an approved estimate with a vendor, I can simply come in at the More button or line by line and create an order. It's as simple as that. When I create the order, it pulls all the information in for me. So that was this time I did it from the line. You can also do it here to create it with these lines. Now I've already created one here, but you can pick it either way. Okay, so there is another question. If I entered a vendor invoice for part of the line, how do I bill the entire PO? Okay, so you wouldn't be able to. So it's important if you're billing the client from the order, you want to create the order lines the way that you will be billing the client. So if you're billing the client, let's say you have a $10,000 order that's being billed $5,000 per month, or whatever it might be. You would want to create multiple lines on the order so that you can pre-bill each line as you need to. If you're not billing the order all at once, you would enter it in multiple lines to pre-bill it line by line. Or if you know you're pre-billing the order in its entirety, you would simply just hit and I can show you that on an order. You would just, and again, we're not going to go over the pre-billing much, but yes, it would certainly be an option to only bill the order line by line, or if you've already linked it to the vendor invoice, then you're going to be billing the client from the vendor invoice. So only if you separate it line by line would you then be able to do a part of a pre-bill still on the lines that were open and not yet tied to the vendor invoice. And that was Dahlia's question. So, and a question of entering vendor invoice for part of the line, again, then you would not be able to pre-bill the entire PO. If you're going to pre-bill the PO, you would do that prior to reconciling to the vendor invoice. So I think I answered that question for you. So on the order here, just a quick reference that I have. So again, once this is approved, if you did this line by line, you can then, connect it line by line, close it line by line, pre-bill it line by line. So otherwise, you would, once it's approved, that's when you would want to pre-bill an entire order if we're not waiting for the vendor invoice. So again, not touching much on the pre-bill this time. That could be covered in an additional, because it does relate more to billing and media orders especially, so that will be probably on an upcoming webinar. Now I do want to make sure I get through some additional expense types. So we have our estimate, purchase orders, vendor invoices. Now certainly we're going to also go into entering just a regular vendor invoice. So I could come in, I could still have another vendor that maybe I have an overhead vendor invoice. I can have a vendor set up as overhead. I can, put in whatever number it is. That's a weird one. And I can certainly come in and create a vendor invoice that's for overhead as well, whatever it might be. And it's just saying, I can skip the item, even if I require items, if I have an overhead vendor. So you can put in expenses that are part of overhead, of course. I can also schedule reoccurring invoices and other transactions, by the way. So this is just an example of one of the overhead vendor invoices. And of course, if you're not doing orders, you can also come in and create a vendor invoice to the client project. So maybe I have some consulting invoices that I want to relate to a project. That's fine. I could put this in with the quantity of work that this consulting company is doing, whatever unit costs. And there are some setup details that can expedite the unit cost and rates and so forth, whether or not it's marked up. And I can put this to any project that it relates to. I'll put this, no, I better put it back to the project one. And then what is the item? What's nice is the item itself can come in and be the designated accounts that you want these items going to. So you don't have to remember all of the expense and trying to look for a kind of an outsourced, there we go, we'll do talent. But it already has things set up to automatically find those accounts for you. So if I just do a vendor invoice, I can also relate that to the project, and now I have this item on the project automatically for me, and I could relate line by line to different projects, just like the orders. So same thing can happen with associating vendor invoice lines. So you don't have to have an order. That's just a purchase order is part of your process, and whether or not you would enter it this way without the order. Now, if I looked in that project again, we're going to see now in our budget an item that's in addition to, I might have to approve that first, but there's my talent item that's going to have me way over my budget. So I'm going to delete this one. All right, so I think maybe that, oh, and I do have a question about a billing worksheet. We're going over expenses today, so we won't be covering anything related to billing. Sorry about that. There are some past webinars, so we went through some billing, but just a quick answer is it's an electronic way to see what's available to bill or mark billed on projects. So, all right. So I want to enter some other types of expenses in my project, and one of them is if you are using expense reports. I want to show this. It's a very similar entry screen to what you do for your vendor invoices, but this allows employees to be able to come in and create expense reports in the system and add what items that they've paid out of pocket that you then need to reimburse them for. So they can put in what date it is of their expense, what project it relates to, if it's related to a client project. Maybe they had to do some review with the client and it's some mileage. So if you have some, costs in here, it's mileage. Is there a receipt? You can actually go out and add an attachment for that receipt, put in some billing comments. And again, you can do this line by line. Oh, I do need the, I do need the item. So I have the item already in there for mileage. So what did I pay for out of pocket? Maybe the week before on the other project, I had some meals that I need to, maybe it's called food. Now the list that appears here are only for expense reports, by the way, versus when you estimate, you'll pull from your purchase item list, expense report, media, any of those lists you can pull into estimate. But if I'm on an expense report, the only things that I can use are what we have created in the system for that purpose. So on here, I can have an item related to, maybe this is related to project 2. If not, if it's just overhead and not related to a client project, that's fine. Whether or not it's required to say what task, if it is related to a client project or not, is up to you. These can be submitted for approval, or if the person's their own approver, they can simply approve it. Now, if I come back out, I can see my unsubmitted. I can come in and edit. And this is already pre-set up in the employee records to be able to use and then send these through the system. But let me go ahead and approve this one. And one of the questions was, when I create an expense report, how do I get back to the ones that are mine? Well, under the global search and views, everyone has this view of expense reports. Now, they would not see these other options typically. They would only be able to come in to see their own based on security rights and setup. But they would be able to come into this one that's set up specifically to who is it that's logged in. Let me search for my expense reports. So they could see them here. But these get routed through the system, and you can see once it's approved, I can now go ahead and convert it to a vendor invoice. So these are going to work through the system. If I come out to my purchasing today again, we can also be seeing some expense reports. So here's one I have that I need to go ahead and still invoice and create a vendor invoice for so I can pay back the employee. So as it moves through the project, it's also in here to see as part of my transaction. So if I look at my project transactions, I see it in the status of expense report. Now, just talking, not going through any billing, you can, similar to an order, I could bill it in this state, or I can wait till it becomes an actual voucher to then bill it to the client. But we see it still in the project even before we convert it to a vendor voucher. I can come in here as my purchasing manager, and I can now go ahead and say, I want to now convert this to a vendor invoice so I can pay back my employee. Now, certainly, if you pay them back in different ways, you know, payroll or so forth, you can just set it as paid. So depending on how you actually process these, or if you cut a check back to the employee, that will vary as far as how we actually use these in the system. But I can come in and just say, I'm ready to convert that. And now it's in here to pay just like a regular vendor to pay back the employee. All right. So I do have a question about header projects on a vendor invoice that I just saw. One thing to note that if you put a header project on the vendor invoice, what that does really is that every time you add a line, it pre-fills in the line with the projects that's on the header of the invoice. So note that usually if you're going to have multiple projects on a vendor invoice, you don't typically have the header project because it's not going to relate to all the lines that are within that. The header project is just so that when you add lines, it pre-fills the vendor project or the project for you automatically. Hope that answers your question, Gail. So let me go through some addition. Okay, so I think I've answered most of the questions. So what I would like to go through next is the miscellaneous cost. That's really quick and easy. If I'm in a project, I have the ability to add a miscellaneous cost. If I'm out here on purchasing, oh, no, I was going to say, maybe, let me come back into my project. There are a few different ways, but if I'm in a project and I want a miscellaneous cost, what this really is when you have a bulk agency purchase, supplies that you purchase, subscriptions, stock photography that you make bulk purchases of, and now you want part of that associated to this client's project, I simply have to just come into the project, enter if I want to say whether or not it's related to a you know, task or not, and what is the item that I want associated back to the project. So I can come in and say, well, maybe it was supplies of some sort, and I just want to put an amount in here that I want to be able to bill back to the client. I don't have to, it doesn't have to go through an approval system. It's just simply entered, and I see it in the project to bill back this item to the client. Now, remember, if it can be used then when we do P&L overhead allocation, because what it can look at is, again, how do I want to allocate? And it's going to see that I do have part of the costs I've put back to the client record. So just note that it will relate to some of those reports for you automatically to see that here's something that maybe I did a bulk purchase at the beginning of the year of $5,000 of supplies, and now we've used about $100 of those on this project. So it's just a quick way to add that into the project for those bulk purchases. So it's in here as well. It's immediately available in my project as an item that's linked to the project. Okay, so I have a question about reoccurring expenses monthly. So if you do schedule a reoccurring expense and it relates to a project, you could do that as a vendor invoice and just have it scheduled and have the line automatically set up on the vendor invoice and have it scheduled. And when you schedule, you can have them automatically generate or remind you to generate. So that would be one way. So it would, now under the miscellaneous costs, other transactions can be scheduled, miscellaneous costs. There is not a schedule under that one. Uploading receipts to an expense report, it would be really attaching that, and I'll go back to the expense report to show that. It's really just adding the attachment, and you can drag drop multiple items to an expense report or in the system anywhere to attach it. Versus upload, it's really not an upload, it's just an attach and then finding the multiple attachments to add, and I'll show you that. And there is not a limit associated with miscellaneous costs. That's an interesting question. That's a good question. But no, there's actually not a miscellaneous cost limit currently anywhere in the system. So I misspoke. Here's your create schedule for your miscellaneous costs. I'm just going to say, I'm going to go back in and check that. We have made some changes within here for Platinum. So you can create the schedule here for your miscellaneous costs, and it would just reoccur. Now this schedule for transactions is throughout, so journal entries, invoices, miscellaneous costs, and so forth. So it just lets you come in and define how often and when and how many times you want this scheduled. I'm going to go ahead and delete this schedule, but yes, you can come in and create it here. On the invoices, it's under more, so there are some options there to schedule these as well. So yes, thank you for that question. Okay, and on reoccurring invoice payments, the update of the invoice number, there were some things reviewed a while back. I need to go back to some of those development things in Platinum they were looking at as far as the reoccurring. And let me review that. And Gail, if you want to send that question in to support, I can answer that more fully for you about updating scheduled invoice payment numbers automatically. So that's a good question. If you don't mind following up with a support question, we can fully answer that one. So if you have a reoccurring expense related to a project, subscription, or the client in general, again, the miscellaneous cost schedule, yes, you can schedule those as well. And let me show the upload receipt. Limit on, I'm just trying to go through the question. Sorry about that. So the miscellaneous costs would just post. It's already posted when you do the bulk purchase. There is a question about posting to the general ledger. So the post of the miscellaneous costs would be if you pull that miscellaneous cost on into the client invoice and post it then on the sales side, because your actual bulk purchase has already posted. This is just to now bill back part of that to the client. So it would post based on the client invoice side. So it does not post the expense because it's already been posted during the bulk purchase. All right, so on the expense report, let me go back to the expense report to show, maybe I'll just do a new one real quick to show you that additional attachment. So if I'm doing an attachment here, I can come out and click plus and I can select multiple files to just open and that would upload those. So that's your multiple upload really. You just add the plus sign, or if I have my window open on the side, I can drag and drop them onto that attachment to just automatically attach those there. So I think that answered that question there. All right, so we're going to run out of a little bit of time, so I do want to make sure I get through the additional credit card connector, because that's a big one that a lot of people use. So I don't want to rush too much through this, but hopefully the miscellaneous cost is explained. So again, I see that transaction now in here. I also see my expense report converted to a voucher at this point. And back to our budget, we're tracking all of these. Were these budgeted for? Am I over budget? So everything's showing up in here now to say, gee, you're over budget. We didn't, have a budget for this or this. Well, oh, this I did, but some of these I did not. So we're trying to track that individually or throughout. The credit cards are a charge. They're an expense. We can tie them to a project or not. I'm going to come back here first. By the way, if I use my Shift key and I come into the system setup, it's going to leave me on my current page. That's just a little platinum tip. When you use your Shift key and navigate, you can come back immediately to where you were. I do want to show today, just because this is so new and so many questions surrounding, we have a new connection for credit cards. So if you were using an old connection to automatically download your nightly transactions, those often have had been, coding changes on the bank sites that have prevented those sometimes from working, or maybe the card quit supporting it. We do now have a new third-party Plaid connection that works with most banks, and it is going to work now. What we do, we can set up some calls to help you through this or send you some more details. But what's nice is it's a new connection that if you say, I'm going to connect my GL credit card accounts now through this system, you'll see a lot more available options, and you can even add your own bank that you don't see here. So we were very limited in the legacy connection, that now we have an ability to connect a lot of bank cards here that can then automatically download for you to code and process into those charges. So what that does, now obviously this is an instance where we don't currently have that set up with a real card, but I do have a few charges to show you in here to process. So we can also import to the connector, which is a holding place. It's a holding place to say, we have these charges on these transactions. How do I want to code them? Are they overhead? Do they go to a client project? Did I pay a vendor invoice with them? Which there's a couple ways. But it allows me to come in and say, here's a charge. This charge I know relates to maybe one or more projects. So same thing with your vendor invoice, where you can put multiple lines, your orders, your expense reports. I can do the same thing here on a charge. So I can say, well, this was for an item. Maybe it was called interactive or internet. It's my internet item. I can put in a memo. And what else is nice is I can say, well, it relates to this project, or I can even split it between projects. So you see the box I checked that said split. As soon as I did that, it gave me this line to say, oh, you're associating this to multiple projects. So I can say this is to project 1, and it's for this item, and maybe I want to associate 200 of the charge. And then I can insert another row, and I can put part of it to this project, maybe even associate it to a task if I want, and also decide what amount that defaults to the remaining amount, and I can save that. So this lets me code these. Now there's a lot of setup involved. So again, we can do additional calls with you individually with your account managers to help with these things. If you aren't using this connector at all, we can help show you that, set it up. You can also import them from your bank, export and import. So there's other options if you're not using the auto download. But it lets me code these to then say, now I'm ready and I want this processed into an actual charge. So remember, if I don't want some of these processed, that's fine. The first download, you can clear them and not really turn them into a charge if they're already one, or you've created them manually. We can match them to ones that you create manually. So there's lots of different options in here. But if I say, here's my charge, I split it between projects, go ahead and process it. it will process that now into an actual charge. And if I look at my project, I will see that now in my project transactions. So now I have this credit card charge, and it's also in the other project. So that's what processes it. Now this one, depending on the approval, you can have them automatically approve and post, or they may also route for an additional approval. But you can tie them into your projects, or you can come in and simply say, no, this is an overhead charge. I don't need to associate it to any project, and just simply process it into a charge. Now, if you pay vendor invoices by credit card, you can come in and do it one by one. If it's really a one-off, you can say, well, this is the vendor, and it paid for this invoice, and you can tie the credit card charge to your vendor invoice if needed. If you do a lot of that and you, I think I have to, okay, I always get the error once if you actually pay a lot of vendor invoice by credit card, there's an easier way. And if you do them here to just pay these vendor invoices by credit card, then what we do here is we come in and just match them to the ones that you created manually through this system, and it just lets you match the ones that are already created in the system that you don't need in the connector. So again, I can just come in, what was the item, was it mileage? Again, your items should be set up to already know what expense and sales accounts they go to, so you don't have to think about it. And then you can simply come in and decide what project does this relate to, if it is related to a client project, or split it. So I'm surprised no questions, no chat, no question. You guys are getting quiet. Did everybody leave? Oh no. Okay, so once we process those as well, their charges, sometimes if you refresh your page, it does, again, all of these screens refresh periodically. But you can also see that I now have this in my credit card charges to pay screen. So as I'm creating all these expenses, if I'm the purchasing person, I also have all of these highlights out here. I have open orders and approved orders. I have to come in and review and code some connector things that are in that holding area to process them into charges. I have invoices waiting for approval. So you can see how easy it is to come in and see what's in the system, checks to print, things to pay. And then I can also go into all of these views of items that are created. I can also come into my purchasing reports easily. I have a daily feed of what's gone on. So you have a lot of quick things to see. I can drill into these from here. So it's really tying everything nicely together for you and linking orders to invoices to projects and so forth for you. Now, let me think of what I forgot. Oh, I have a question. Oh, that's a great question. Jana's question about tying a purchase order to a credit card. We do not have that ability, and it's asked occasionally, but we do not have a credit card charge available to pay an order currently, because an order typically is still tied to a vendor invoice, and then you would pay the vendor invoice. So that is a good question. I know there are some different workflows with orders and not then wanting an actual vendor invoice related to the order. So there's been a lot of discussion around that. Happy to dive in deeper too, Jen, if you want to send a more detailed question in for us to answer, because there's been a lot of discussion and talk around that. But no, we actually don't pay an order. We can pre-bill it, but we don't actually pay the order. We pay a vendor invoice. So there's a question about not using the credit card connector, but entering receipts as a vendor invoice and then pay it with the correct card. When the credit card comes in, all the charges related to the statement. Okay, so all right, so you do a vendor invoice and then pay that by a credit card manually, I might have to answer that one a little more detailed. If I create a manual charge, I could also then come in and put in the information and tie it to a vendor invoice if I need to. The pay credit card and reconciling of the credit card really is here to say what's my statement date, and now I want to come in and pay all the charges that are in the system. So what this would do is really say, here's the payment. Does this amount of what I've created as charges in the system match what my statement shows? And you do process credits, by the way, but the payments you actually create. So when we go through the accounting session for payments, receipts, and the full accounting, we will cover more of this information. This was more on creating the expenses themselves, but we do have different ways to help you handle the purchase orders versus credit card charges versus, entering them as vendor invoices. So let us help you out with some continued calls and maybe some support questions sent in to help you through some of this. Or again, feel free to certainly schedule some additional training calls to go through this because those are all great questions. And I know people have a lot of different workflows and setup needs as far as approval. Just one last note, because we are at our time limit today, there is additional setup, of course, as far as what your preferences are, your default preferences for who approves the actual vendor invoices and things related to purchase order. So we can come in and help you find some of the system setup needs if you're not seeing what you expected today. Just note that, again, any expense we enter in the system in any way, whether it's a vendor invoice, credit card charge that's not tied to a client project, goes towards your overhead. If we tie it to client projects, whether or not you actually want to bill it or not, or it gets marked billed, if it's part of a fixed fee or retainer, that's all based on a lot of settings and project settings and client settings. So it's really how are you connecting the expense, and if it relates to a client project, can you see in the budget whether or not it's over budget now, and can you see those items in the project? And remember, it's the line item itself that is really the connection to the project. So one of the questions that came in was, if I put a project in the header field and I say this is for project 1, but then I have multiple lines to lots of different projects, well, it's the line itself in the actual invoice here that matters to the actual project that it relates to. So this is the connection to the project. This was the reference to the header field. They should match. So usually you don't have a header project if you have multiple projects on the line. This just means if I enter a line, it's automatically going to add my header project for me. So just a few tips and tricks for you. I hope you enjoyed the session. I hope I answered all of the questions you had. We're happy to continue answering questions as you try some of these things. Remember our new support area. You can come in and, for example, just type in purchase order and get an overview of the workflow of purchase orders, or type in your topic, or we can help find additional answers for you, specific needs that you have, and help you through tracking all of your expenses in the system, which then are easily tracked and reported on. So thank you all for joining, and appreciate all the participation and the great questions. And again, if I didn't answer some of them that you have, certainly send them in to us on the support@workamajig.com. And thank you so much, and have a great day. Bye.